Heresy Alpha, Book 1 of the Marian Imperium by Richard Warren. Chapter 4. Alistair. Birthdays were always a disappointment. The young man looked out across the forecourt of the old basilica and sighed. There was nobody about, just the usual army of pigeons, hell-bent on expressing their disdain for the ancient edifice in the usual way, and, in so doing, adding to the calcifying excrescence that by now entirely coated the ancient stone, just as their pigeon ancestors had done 4 centuries before them. Alistair picked up a stone and threw it at the flock of birds. The silence was momentarily shattered by a desperate flurry of wings. Then, like a shroud, the basilica's habitual stillness settled upon it once more. The sun was just beginning to set. Alistair watched its rosy fingertips clawing at the dilapidated statues on top of the arcade. He felt sad. This year was a special year, but in his heart, Alistair knew it would be just the same as every other. He wondered whether any of the poor friars even remembered that it was his birthday, let alone the year of his majority. Perhaps Father Zosim might, but he'd surely be the only one. That wasn't just because he was so fond of Alistair. Lately, Alistair couldn't help noticing that many of the friars had become terribly forgetful. None were under 40 now, after all, and age was beginning to tell on them. Father Zosim, whose wit was still razor-sharp, was the exception. He looked up at the statues of the saints. Many had lost their heads or limbs, but he still knew everyone by name. Like old friends, they'd always been there for him on the many long, lonely evenings. He shifted uncomfortably. He didn't even know how long he'd been sitting there, and chided himself for his forgetfulness. The marble of the plinth had made him numb, and his back ached from leaning against the hard column. He grimaced as he shunted his ungainly frame, trying to shake off his pins and needles. Father Zosim had once told him that the Lord did not smile upon the gluttonous. It was true, of course. Father Zosim never lied. Yet sometimes the truth was an uncomfortable thing. Something glimmered on the far side of the piazza. A figure was stirring beneath the arcade. It was just one of the Marians doing the evening rounds. Alistair watched the young man, who couldn't have been much older than he was. A handsome young Latin, he was everything Alistair was not, and never would be. He watched enviously as the legionnaire loitered beneath the basilica portals, his slender figure and chiselled face thrown into relief by the sienna of the evening sun. The black baton at the guard's side glowed, but not with the sunset. The red light emanating from within showed that its charge was active. This Latin was one of the new ones, whom he knew only by sight. They were all like that at the start, especially when it was their first military assignment. Serious, exacting, and, above all, unfriendly. He remembered the evening curfew, and that he should return to the dormitory soon. Some of the older Marians had grown more relaxed with time, but he wasn't sure about this one. He looked rather bored. He'd best not give him something to think about. He slid off the high plinth, his oversized feet colliding clumsily with the ground. He staggered as the pins and needles came back on with a vengeance. The soldier glanced across at him. Alistair quickly steadied himself and scuttled across the piazza. He felt the guard's eyes following him as he went, but he didn't look up. The curfew wasn't the only reason for his haste. Alarmingly, his daydreaming might well have cost him his dinner too. That was unlike him. Mealtimes were the highlight of his day, and it was rare indeed that he missed one. The poor friars always took their meals early, and there was no admittance to the refectory if you were late. They were funny like that. They were such kind people who made allowances for all sorts of things. Truth be told, he wasn't a poor friar himself, and wasn't actually sure they were meant to let him share their meals at all. They always did, though, but for some reason insisted that he was never late, and Father Zosim was the fussiest by far. Sometimes Alistair wondered if the kind old man even realised that he wasn't actually a novice. Not that they'd had one of those in a long time. He ran past the basilica, towards the ruins of the Apostolica Palace, his clumsy frame waddling. While he may not have been the fastest, he did know the reservation like the back of his hand. Taking a back alley, he skirted the monstrance fountain and passed through the cluster of wooden huts, which the poor friars for some reason liked to call their dormitory. That had something to do with the old language, which they were awfully fond of using to name pretty much anything they could. Why they had to make life harder for themselves was beyond him. It was just another of their curious oddities that they so noisy to do away with. He shrugged. They named their food that way too, and it was always good. In a few minutes he had reached the refectory, by now quite out of breath. As he approached, he smiled at the Marian who stood guard by the ancient oak doors of the dilapidated little hut. She was one of the older and friendlier ones. The soldier nodded back at him and gesticulated with her thumb at the door, indicating that they were all in there already and that he'd better hurry along. The sundial on the ruined temple wall told just before the hour. He was just in time. Glancing back at the Marian, he imagined what it must be like to have a magic watch that could tell you the time whenever you wanted. That was an outsider thing, though. Such things weren't allowed in the reservation. Other kids probably got them on their birthdays, but he was an orphan, so there wouldn't have been anyone to give him one anyway. As he walked through the doors, Alistair reflected that there were a lot of outsider things like magic watches that he didn't understand. He'd been born outside, but couldn't remember where he came from. He'd only been a young child when he left. He only had one memory from that time, of being held in the arms of a woman whose golden hair glinted in the evening sun. There was icon of the Virgin too, her sorrowful face illuminated by a lamp. The woman was crying and embracing him, but he didn't know why. When he watched the sunsets in the piazza, he hoped their last rays might reveal her again. One thing he did know was that his birthplace was a long way away and much colder than the Latian homelands. He also knew that it was very different outside. Perhaps that was why when outsiders visited, they always thought the reservation was much bigger than it really was, because of all the old ruins. It must have looked grand to them. They didn't know he and the friars actually lived in just a few ramshackle dachas behind the basilica. The friars were already seated. They lined 2 wooden tables facing one another across the cramped hall. At its head was a high table on a raised platform, at which the bishop, Father Vigilius, and a few of the older friars sat. Beside the bishop was Father Zosim, whose beady green eyes followed Alistair from under his bushy brows as he shuffled along, trying to be as quiet as he could. The old man nodded at the one remaining chair by the door. Alistair slid his large thighs under the table, trying not to scrape the floor with the rickety chair legs. The old men sat quietly with their hands folded before them on the table, the heavy woolen cloth of their cassocks tucked under the oak board. Most of the tonsured heads were grey. Only the occasional black or blonde hair could be seen making a last stand on an otherwise balding pate. The majority looked down at their hands, or straight ahead in silent contemplation. If that was indeed what it was, Alistair could never quite be sure. 1 or 2 might well have been asleep. Sometimes he thought they more resembled a flock of old birds than the last monastic order of the West. The rotting timber of the rafters cast long shadows across the refectory. He'd never understood why they couldn't have a little more light at meal times. It was entirely windowless in here, and even during the daytime, the heavy oak did an excellent job of blocking out the fierce Mediterranean sun. The candles were always too few, and most were placed on the high table. The bronze crucifix on the wall behind the high table, with a diagonal line of scarlet paint daubed across it, was about the only thing that could be seen clearly. The only actual light in the entire place, and the only techne in the entire reservation, was a faint dot in one corner of the ceiling, which permanently shone red. Alistair disliked it, and had never understood what the point of it was. When he'd asked Father Zosim about it, he'd just told him that it was the law. Then he'd said something about an emperor, which Alistair hadn't understood. His stomach rumbled loudly. He looked around in embarrassment, but no one had noticed. There was no sign of the food yet, and the wait was becoming interminable. His foot twitched nervously. He had never understood why he always had to be on time just to wait in silence like this before he got to eat. They ought rather to have called it a reflectory than a refectory. In any case, they might at least have spared him the torment on his birthday. Still, as usual, he'd just do what everyone else did. Sit there in silence and try to look as serious as he could. He had no idea why the poor friars were so fond of silence, but he certainly wasn't about to incur the bishop's wrath by finding out. At last, the bishop cleared his throat, raising his fine, wizened face to the room. Some of the friars stirred. His severe, aquiline eyes surveyed the benches before him, his brows contracting as they hovered over Alistair. Father Vigilius was a greybeard too. He was actually younger than Father Zosim, but Alistair couldn't remember him ever having been anything but an austere old man. He was known for his castigations, and it was rumoured among the friars that his mortification exceeded anything that had been seen in the reservation for generations. Alistair had always known, though, that at heart he was a kind man. Like the rest, he had never once questioned his sharing their meals. On his last birthday, he had even let him have a drop of mead. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, Father Vigilius prayed. He raised his eyes to the crucifix, making a movement in that shape across his chest. The friars followed suit, even one or two that Alistair had been sure were asleep a moment earlier. One of them actually kept his head down and his eyes closed as he crossed himself. Alistair copied the rest. The light on the ceiling blazed a purpureal red like clotted blood, before reverting to its usual crimson. 2 middle-aged friars entered the refectory from a side door. It was their turn to wait at table this evening, and to prepare the meals during the day. All the poor friars had to take their turn, unless they were elders. It hadn't taken Alistair long to be able to tell their cooking apart. He had his favourites, but they were all excellent cooks. Sometimes he wondered why they didn't ask him to do his bit, and had initially felt bad for not volunteering. When he'd asked Father Zosim, the old man had said something about the discipline and life of the monk, which as usual Alistair didn't really understand. So, after a few years, he'd concluded it was just another friar thing, and left it at that. Still, he had a nagging feeling the real reason might be that they didn't much fancy his cooking. Benedic Domine nos et haec tua dona, Father Vigilius continued, blessing the bread that the friars set on the board before the monks. Alistair's stomach rumbled again, and his mouth watered. The bread was freshly baked with rosemary and garlic, in the Latian style, and the sweet fragrance filled the room. He was seized with the temptation to grab it at once, but he learned years ago that he must wait. As a boy, he'd earned himself a stern reprimand from Father Zosim for failing to do so. It was another of the poor friar's curiosities, and how he'd first learned what a sin was. Under no circumstances would they partake of any food before they'd pronounced their Latin incantation over it. Even so, the exertion of resistance was nearly making him faint. Father Vigilius mumbled something else in Latin as the rest of the food was brought out. The ingredients were simple, as befitted the friar's station, but they were always well prepared. The soup was hearty and full of beans, and the vegetables were fresh. The monks grew everything themselves, since much of the reservation was really just a farm. Even the forum of the old patriarchs, with its ruined temples and the big arch with the pictures of the forsaken people, was no more than a giant allotment. The friars didn't waste an inch of the few paltry hectares that were theirs by ancient law. They couldn't afford to do anything else. The Marians gave them nothing. Not because they were mean. Some of the guards could even be kind on occasion. That was just the way it was. It was illegal. Agimus tibi gratias, omnipotens Deus, Father Vigilius concluded, making thanks for the food granted them. Amen. His last word was taken up by all. Alistair repeated it too, and the light mellowed to a rich burgundy. He didn't know what it meant, just that he had to say it before he could eat. Now he fell on his food like one of the pigeons, snapping at everything all at once. He felt Father Zosim's disapproving eyes on him, but he wasn't going to trouble himself about that. He hadn't waited all this time for nothing. Vitas Sancti Cassiani, another friar began, as Alistair tucked into a large piece of bread. The life of the most venerable Saint Cassian. It was so dark that Alistair couldn't see who was doing the reading this evening. It sounded like one of the newer friars, if such a word could really be applied to any of them. Someone always read during meals, and they took turns with that too. It was another of those oddities Alistair had become accustomed to over time. He wasn't actually sure any of them even knew what they were listening to, if they were listening at all. It was always something about someone who had died long ago, and it was always so boring. Wasn't the food interesting enough on its own? For in those days, in the reign of Julian the Apostate, the voice droned on, the people had turned away from the true faith and back to the old gods, forgetful of our Lord. Alistair had already finished his bread and looked with envy at the untouched piece before his half-dozing neighbour. He caught Father Zosim's eye, who nodded at the bowl of soup in front of him. He could already hear the chastisement that usually accompanied that look, that he ought not to covet that which belonged to others, and that he should rather look to his own and be grateful thereof, and so on. Alistair reluctantly eyed his soup. He began noisily ladling chunks of turnip and carrot into his mouth, splashing the oak board as he did so. Father Zosim frowned. But the holy Cassian was not swayed by the unbelief of his fellow men, the monk continued in his nasal voice, for he was strong in his faith, and strayed not from the true path, for the truth had been revealed unto him, and Cassian knew that the Daedalic hall had long fallen, that Phoebus no longer had his mantic laurel, nor his prophetic spring, and that the speaking waters had been silenced. Alistair glumly contemplated his empty bowl. He was finding it hard to follow. He often didn't really get what the readings were about. Their Latin was usually very old as well, which didn't help. He had no trouble with the italic spoken in the reservation, but the old tongue was another matter. It wasn't that they hadn't tried to teach him when he was a kid. Father Zosim had kept at it for many years, and deep down, Alistair suspected that even now the old man hadn't entirely given up. That was another of the monk's favourite subjects, that he didn't try hard enough at his Latin. He'd once heard a rumour that the outsiders had some way of magically speaking to each other in their own tongues and being immediately understood. It was like a dream. But Julian had forgone the wisdom of his forefathers, and strayed wide of the true path. The lecture continued, as Alistair stifled a yawn and stole another look at his neighbour's untouched bread. Alas, ever is it so that the sinner cannot brook the sight of the good man and his good deeds, and so, when it reached the emperor's ear from the venerable Cassian's own pupils that he was teaching the true faith, instead of urging them to take up again with false gods, the emperor was wroth indeed. Julian's retribution was swift and cruel. The emperor decreed that Cassian, the holy martyr, should die at the hands of his very own disciples. Thus, unlike the pagan Socrates, whose students defended him to the last, the holy martyr was instead stoned to death by the very children who ought to have venerated him most. The red light pulsed lazily at the word martyr. He had to make haste now, before the final prayer. He stealthily reached across the table and broke off half his neighbour's bread, who in no wise reacted to this involuntary sharing of his dinner. Alistair did not look at the high table, knowing full well that his misdeed would not have escaped the old man's notice. Besides, it was his birthday. If he couldn't have extras today, when could he? He reached over and grabbed the rest of the bread. The refectory quietened down as the friars finished eating. Alistair stuffed the second chunk of bread into his mouth, glancing half defiantly at the high table. He just had time to see Father Zosim shaking his head before Father Vigilius pushed back his chair. The bishop made the crossing motion on his chest again, facing the hall in silence. Everyone rose, save those too old or infirm to stand. Pater noster, Father Vigilius began, with the usual words. Those words which Alistair had heard repeated every day after every meal for as long as he could remember, were probably the only Latin ones he really knew by heart. He had once told Father Zosim that, in one of his little abortive acts of defiance. To his surprise, the old monk had replied that to know those words was, in truth, enough. It was at that point that Alistair had realised he was probably never going to understand everything that went on in Father Zosim's head, all the more so because, ever since that peculiar conversation, the monk had gone on trying to drum still more Latin into his brain. It didn't make any sense, but Alistair didn't want to disappoint him. He had learned over time that the monk had his ways, and it was usually best just to go along with them. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us, the bishop continued, his words echoing in every mouth in the little hut. Alistair mumbled them under his breath, glancing furtively at the high table. Father Zosim was no longer looking at him, though, but was instead gravely contemplating his folded hands. Alistair wondered what any of them had to be forgiven. What was said about the outsiders was true. Weren't the friars the ones to be pitied? They weren't known as poor for nothing. Father Vigilius soon got to the bit about temptation and being delivered from evil. That had always been Alistair's least favourite. He forgot what he'd been thinking about, observing the now clear board before him. It was true that perhaps he oughtn't to have taken that extra half of bread, nor the rest of it, for that matter, but it would have gone to waste otherwise. Besides, it was his birthday. Why had no one remembered or said anything? For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen, the bishop finished, his voice rising with remarkable power. For a brief moment, his face seemed that of some hale young shepherd astride one of the 7 hills of the old city, facing the morning sun. The ceiling light fired, then died. So too, Father Vigilius blazed, but briefly, before crumpling back into the body of an old man. There was a loud scraping of chairs, but Father Zosim stood up and raised his hand. A flotilla of tonsured heads rotated towards him. I would like to take this opportunity to make a brief announcement, Father Zosim said, for it is a special day today for one amongst us. One, it is true, who is not strictly of our order, but one whom we nonetheless all count as our own. The old man, followed by all the rest, turned to Alistair and smiled. His freckles burned magenta as he shuffled uncomfortably in his chair. He'd been sure they'd forgotten. Now that he knew they hadn't, his habitual shyness reasserted itself. Perhaps he ought to have been more careful what he prayed for. And while it is not our rule to give gifts to one another, I think an exception can be made for one who is not, strictly speaking, of our order, Father Zosim continued, with a wink at Alistair. He nodded to one of the younger friars who had been serving. The monk stepped out of the shadows, carrying something wrapped in green velvet. In the dark, it was impossible to tell what it was, but Alistair's heart leapt with excitement. Had the friars somehow induced the Marians to smuggle in one of their devices, perhaps even a magic watch? There were kinder ones among them, after all. Not the zealous guard in the piazza, for sure, but there were others who were even rather fond of him. Some of the monks were smiling, evidently in on the secret already. Now he thought about it, quite a few of the friars must have been in on it. Perhaps they all were. Getting one of those watches in would have been no mean feat, what with the ancient ban on all techny in the reservation. The monk handed Alistair the bundle of green cloth. In his agitation, he forgot his embarrassment, grasping at it eagerly. It was hard and surprisingly heavy. That was odd. One of the Marians had once told him that their gadgets were always made to be as light as possible. It had to be some kind of wooden box or small chest. That was it. They'd put goods in a box. They'd have to hide it, and hide it well. Alistair hastily placed the box on the board in front of him as a group of friars gathered round to watch. A few even brought candles with them to get a better view. Running his hands over the soft velvet, he greedily opened the folds of cloth, as if he were unpeeling an orange. Delving into their dark recesses, he became flustered. The velvet had been intricately overlaid in a tight knot, whose unravelling was no small labour. At last he succeeded. Standing back and screwing up his eyes in the dark, gold lettering gradually stood out. Novum Testamentum, he slowly read, aloud, the words involuntarily spilling from his lips. As his eyes adjusted, the form of a book emerged from the shadows. Not just any book. The book. A copy of the book. There was no box. No box. And that meant one thing. There was no treasure. No magic watch. His heart fell. So, what does our young friend say? Father Zosim interrupted the silence. Alistair beheld the fog of smiling faces, as if waking out of a heavy sleep. The smiles were not ironic, but expectant. Expectant of gratitude. Were they mad? How on earth could they expect him to be happy with a copy of the book on his 18th birthday, and a Latin copy as well? That might be their idea of giving, but it certainly wasn't his. Thank you, he stammered. Thank you, he repeated, forcing himself to smile at all the expectant faces glowing in the candlelight. His eye lit on Father Zosim, one of whose bushy eyebrows had risen. Wrapping the book back in the cloth, he pressed it under his arm and, without another word, ran out of the refectory. "And may it serve you well," Father Zosim called out behind, to chuckling from some of the older friars. Alistair barely heard. Crashing through the wooden doors, he ran past the Marian sentinel without wishing her good night. His tears were already welling up. It was as much as he could do to get out of her sight before he began to sob. He had known it, of course. He had always known it, right from the moment he'd wound up in the reservation. No one really cared about him or what happened to him. The woman with the golden hair was the only one who'd ever cared, and he wasn't even sure if she was real. The monks were kind, but in truth the only thing they were bothered about was their prayers. Their interest in him had never extended beyond that. Besides, why should they care about him? He'd reached his majority now, and wore no tonsure. They knew he was never going to be one of them. Perhaps they'd always known. Maybe that was why Father Zosim always chided him for his unhealthy fascination with the outsiders. A book. A stupid Latin book. That was all he meant to anyone. He was still running, and soon reached the dormitory. He had long inhabited one of the smaller wooden huts, ordinarily reserved for novices, at the end of the row of dachas the monks called home. Though none were particularly luxurious, their interiors being uniformly Spartan, their size depended on the seniority of their inhabitant. As he smashed through the rickety door of his novice's cell, which was no more than a few square passes in size, its dinginess was another cruel reminder of how unimportant he was to everyone. Tossing the book aside, he threw himself face down on his bed and sobbed uncontrollably into his pillow. He had never felt so alone in all his life, even after so many long, lonely years in the reservation. There had been no other children to play with, no brothers or sisters, no mother or father. There'd only ever been the monks for company, the pigeons, and, on rare occasions, the friendlier ones among the guards. Now, at last, he knew that in truth even that meant nothing.